health, wealth, and divine favor. For millions and millions of people all over the world, this isn't just some wishful thinking. It's a core promise right at the heart of their faith. So today, we're going to dive into prosperity theology, what it is, where it came from, and why it's still one of the most powerful and, let's be honest, controversial movements in modern Christianity. It really all comes down to this one pretty provocative question. Does God want you to be rich? And this isn't just about your bank account. It's a question that gets at a really deep tension inside Christianity itself, this conflict between scriptures that praise the poor and a modern theology that holds up wealth as, well, the ultimate sign of God's blessing. So, what exactly is prosperity theology? Well, at its core, it's the belief that being well off financially and healthy physically aren't just things you can hope for, they are God's explicit will for every single believer. It basically reframes faith as this kind of key, something you can use to unlock a divine promise for a good life, right here on earth. But, these ideas didn't just appear out of thin air. To really get a handle on this gospel of wealth, we have to go back and look at the long and often really complicated relationship that Christianity has always had with money. Historically, you can think of Christian views on wealth as flowing in about three main streams. First, you've got the idea of wealth as an offense, that having stuff is just fundamentally at odds with a spiritual life. Then there's wealth as an obstacle, where the idea is that money itself isn't bad, but the love of it is the real danger. But it's this third stream, the one that sees wealth as an outcome of a good, righteous life, that really created the theological soil where the prosperity gospel would eventually take root.
Okay, so if prosperity is what God wants for you, how are you supposed to get it? This is where the whole thing shifts from just a belief to a plan of action. It proposes a set of spiritual laws. You could almost call it the mechanics of faith.
Proponents often lay out this clear three-step process. It all starts with faith, but not a passive belief. It's seen as an active spiritual force. Next up is positive confession. This is the practice of actually speaking God's promises of health and wealth out loud, with the belief that speaking them brings them into reality. And finally, giving. Donations are framed as seed faith, like you're planting a spiritual investment in the church, and you should expect it to grow into a much, much larger financial harvest for you personally. And this principle, sometimes it's called the law of compensation, is taught with incredible directness. Just listen to this quote from Gloria Copeland, a very prominent teacher. It makes it crystal clear. Giving isn't just charity, it's a spiritual transaction with a guaranteed and absolutely massive return on investment. So where did this whole system of faith, confession, and giving even come from? Well, the answer is a uniquely American story, really. It's this blend of 19th century metaphysical ideas, some Pentecostal fire, and, of course, the power of television. The story really gets going in the late 1800s with something called the New Thought movement, which pushed this idea that your mind can create your reality. Fast forward to the early 20th century, and ministers like E.W. Kenyon start mixing those ideas with Christianity. Then, in the 1950s healing revivals, the evangelist Oral Roberts really popularized that seed faith concept we talked about. And then came the 1980s. The explosion of televangelism just took these teachings out of the tents and blasted them into millions of living rooms all across the globe. Now, a message this bold, this provocative, was absolutely bound to create controversy. But what's really interesting is that the fiercest debate didn't come from outside the church. It came from right inside it. So let's unpack the core theological arguments that really divide Christians on this whole issue. The whole debate really hinges on totally different ways of reading core Christian beliefs. So take the atonement, the meaning of Jesus' death. Proponents say it was a victory over sin, sickness, and poverty. Critics say, nope, its purpose was spiritual salvation from sin, full stop. And you see the same divide with giving. Is it an investment or is it a selfless act? And even with faith itself, is it a force you use to get results or is it a quiet trust in God no matter what happens? And let's be clear, the criticism is severe. We're talking about mainstream evangelicals and even leaders from the Pentecostal and charismatic movements, the very traditions where these ideas first started bubbling up, who have often called prosperity theology a false gospel or even a heresy. The criticism usually gets boiled down into 5 main points. Critics will argue that the biblical covenant with Abraham is about a spiritual inheritance, not a material one. They'll repeat that Jesus' death was for sin, not poverty. They challenge the motive behind giving, saying it becomes about what you can get. They argue that faith gets twisted into this human-controlled force, and that prayer stops being about communing with God and becomes a way of commanding Him. But here's the thing. Despite decades of really fierce criticism, prosperity theology hasn't just survived, it has absolutely thrived. It's become a true global phenomenon.
So just how widespread are we talking? Well, check this out. A 2006 poll by Time magazine found that 17% of American Christians identified with the movement. That is nearly 1 out of every 5.
And its reach goes way, way beyond the United States. This message has found incredibly fertile ground across the global South. In places like Nigeria, South Korea, and the Philippines, the promise of divine help to overcome economic hardship has a powerful, powerful appeal. And it's fueling the growth of some of the largest churches on the entire planet. So this all brings us back to a really fundamental question that sits at the very heart of this entire debate. Is the purpose of faith to be a tool for achieving prosperity? Or is it meant to be a source of peace and contentment, no matter what your circumstances are? It's a profound question, and, how a person answers it really reveals everything about how they see the relationship between God and the material world.